Guess who got brands talking? Brandlive.co.za.
Hello and welcome to Creative Ghettos, the show that explores various creative industries and profiles the Africans who push them forward. Each week I spend 30 minutes unveiling excellent and inspiring individuals within creative industries, including but not limited to fine and contemporary art, architecture, design, food, film and literature. My name is Kwani Lukunene. Thank you for joining me right here on brandlive.co.za. With the intention of looking at the larger scope of an industry, this week I really wanted to get a feel of what it means to be a channel that connects product to people. My guest this week is Loyiso Langeni, the founder of Book Circle Capital, a bookstore which deals titles primarily written by Africans or people of color. Loyiso was gracious enough to have our conversation take place at his beautiful store at 27 Boxes in Melville, Johannesburg. This is what we spoke about. Loyiso, I want to just dive into the middle of your life story. The moment you thought it was time to open up a bookstore selling only African titles, how did this idea come about?
Well, I used to sell books on a part-time basis, especially markets, especially over weekends, while I was still having a full-time corporate job. So towards the end of last year, in the middle of last year, I decided, let me test the market and resign from my full-time corporate job and start up a fully fledged, African literature shop, because there is a market, that is untapped when it comes to selling African literature in the South African market. So that's where, the whole idea came about.
Okay, so was it just purely based off of the idea that there's a market? I would think there is maybe a deeper reason as to why specifically books and why specifically books written by people of color.
Well, if you go to traditional bookshops, retail shops, you would find like a very small section that focuses on African literature. So that's one of the reasons why that prompted me. And also secondly, it's also important that we also tell our stories and also being able to read our stories written by Africans. So that's one of the motivation that actually prompted me, to test the market and to see how the market will sort of receive, African literature.
Why do you think it took so long to have? I mean, even right now, you're one of very few places that are selling books written by Africans. Why do you think it's taken so long to have platforms such as the store that you have right now?
Well, it's simple. It's based on demand and supply. It's basically economics. I mean, if there's no demand for a certain product on the market, then that particular product will struggle, to be sold. So it's, especially also in terms of South Africa, it's also our history. Our history also plays a part in terms of where we come from. So we have been exposed to a certain kind of literature. And so the African literature is picking up, but it's not at the level where it's supposed to be.
Okay, and with African literature books, we are living in the internet age right now. People are looking for instant gratification, and if you're wanting to learn anything about anything from anywhere, you are basically on the internet and not reading but watching videos. How is this affecting what you do now?
Well, selling books, not only in South Africa, but globally as well, is a big challenge. As you mentioned, there's these technological advances. But there's still a market, for books. If you go to the US as well as the UK, I've traveled, to some parts of those countries. They still have a lot of bookshops. So it's a matter of balancing, what you need. And I also still think that there is a market or there is a need, to have physical books. And of course, how can I put it? You need to adjust as well as adapt, when it comes to technology as well. And so this particular industry also needs to, adapt to certain elements when it comes to technology. But I don't think in the near future, that's my observation that technology will sort of take over, physical books.
And in terms of interest, are people really interested in coming into the store and seeing what you have on offer and purchasing whatever it is that you have on offer?
Well, there is interest, especially on African authors. There is interest, but as I say, compared to other, literature like Afrikaans and your traditional English literature, it's not at the level where it's supposed to be, given the fact that South Africa is an African country. But also, as I mentioned before, it's also an element of, the historical part of where we come from. But there is interest. There is a lot of readers that are actually coming into the store, mostly locals as well as tourists as well, because they also want to be exposed, to our writings as well as our experiences.
Okay, so I want to, swing back to your childhood. Because I think that you've got a very interesting story. I've actually never met a book dealer in my life before, and it would be very interesting to know, like, what are the events that played a part into where you find yourself now in your life. Okay, so where did you grow up, and were you a typical boy who just played outside till the street lights came on, or have you been a bookworm since way back then?
No.
Did I catch you a little?
No, never bookworm. I was very naughty. I was a very naughty boy.
Yeah.
But I went to UCT with the intention of studying a law degree. But at UCT, I still fell under that old curriculum. I had to do an undergraduate degree before you have to do an LLB degree as a postgraduate. So I did a BA degree in languages as well as politics and public affairs and administration. So I suppose that in terms of the exposure, that's where the interest, came from. So one of my majors was African literature. So I read a lot of African literature at UCT, and also, there was a lot of books on African literature. As you can imagine, it's a university, so that's where the interest came from. And then eventually, when I left UCT without completing my law degree, I got a job as a journalist. So I think that my journalism background also had a big impact as well as influence in terms of, having an interest not only on African literature, but also on books as well.
Okay. And influences, I always imagine how your parents and your family can influence you as a young kid to first even just pursue law, but to tap into something in you that makes you gravitate towards loving literature the way you do right now.
Well, it was basically my teachers, of course. I grew up with my grandparents. My mom had to, as you know, the story, like any other black child. They were not around. They had to go to faraway towns, to go and get some money, to go and get some jobs. So I grew up with my grandparents most of the time. So in terms of the influence, it was mostly the teachers and the co-ops within the township. People who really had a positive contribution, within the township at the time. So, but it was mostly my history as well as English teacher, if I were to put it that way, that had a big impact in terms of me, taking the direction that I wanted, that I took in the past.
So before venturing, we spoke about that. You were, before venturing into the book dealing business, you were a journalist, and we've spoken about it. What were some of the things that you learned during your time as a journalist that just showed you the importance of Africans telling their own stories?
Well, I used to work at a business day, so one of my bits was writing on international relations. So I used to travel a lot, extensively, especially on the African continent. And that sort of gave me the exposure in terms of, because I didn't know. Well, I knew, but I had little information. So in terms of being exposed to different cultural experiences. So I think that the journalism background, in terms of traveling across the length and breadth of the African continent, I think that also gave me the motivation to get to learn more about other cultures on the continent. So I think also that element also played a bigger impact in terms of starting this particular bookshop.
Yeah, and speaking about being in different African countries, I mean, how is the reading culture there, and who are some of the, while you were working as a journalist, who were some of the most important books and authors that you were coming across often?
Well, it's still the same as in South Africa. I mean, books generally are very much expensive, and at least here in South Africa we have generally, a variety of bookstores. But I mean, if you were to go to African countries, not all of them, but most of them, generally speaking, I mean, you would find maybe one or two bookstores, in the capital city. So it also has an element, of being expensive, economics. But I would say that Nigerian authors, especially Chinua Achebe, that's where, they have a very, I mean, in terms of the impact that they have, on the cultural setup of Africa, I think that you wouldn't go wrong, with any West African writer, especially Nigerian writers, especially in my case, Chinua Achebe. I fell in love, with that particular author.
Yeah. Which books did you fall in love with?
Books, Things Fall Apart. I think there's an interview that I did with the Mail and Guardian towards the end of last year about a Nigerian guy who gets a scholarship to go and study in the UK. He comes back with all these ideals that he wants to change the world. He wants to change Nigeria from a corrupt state, to be a very good governance country. But there are so many pitfalls. But he ended up, being engulfed and entangled within, the corrupt practices in Nigeria. So that also speaks the same within the South African experience. I mean, there are so many young graduates who come out of university very much motivated to say that they want to change the picture, of South African politics as well as, the public administration. They want to do good, but unfortunately, because of the entrenched culture, of corruption, maladministration, bad governance, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, ends up being tempted, to do the same practices. So that book, I think the title, well, it is Things Fall Apart. So it actually speaks to me, and it's also very much relevant, even though it was written in the 60s, but it's still relevant, to any other African country.
The one thing that I find interesting in my mind, anyways, because I haven't actually traveled throughout Africa, is how people tell different stories and what their points of interest are. So, I mean, here in South Africa, we are pretty much open to as many topics as possible, but in various regions in Africa, some things are closed off to other people. How are you aiming to tell the stories from those regions through the books that you're selling?
I don't know if I get your question, but whenever I traveled, to those countries, I have to observe, the cultural practices, and then I have to respect the norms, and observations of those particular countries, even though I'm a journalist. But I mean, there are certain protocols that you need to follow, and then that's how you are able, to get, the story that you want. But I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly.
Yes, it really is about getting in more stories so that we are able to tap into the fabric of these different countries or different regions, because I do believe that it is in the stories that we're reading that lets us know what's happening in different parts of the world. And I just wanted to know, how are you sourcing stories that tell the most honest, or books rather, that are telling the most honest versions of life, or even imagination from the different parts of Africa?
Well, there is, a vast literature, on the African continent, but unfortunately, most of those books, we get them in the US as well as in the UK and other European countries because of the economics, of the continent. So that's one of the elements that actually plays a part. And also when it comes to publishing, you don't have a lot of publishing houses on the African continent. I mean, you do have Cassava Republic, for instance. It's a Nigerian-owned company, but funny enough, it's based in the UK. Even some other African-related magazines like New African, most of them, even though they speak about and they are being founded by African entrepreneurs, most of them are based in the UK. So it's an element of economics. It's also an element of, the logistics. It's very difficult to move, goods from one part of the African continent to the other because of we don't have a lot of trade between. The trade is there, but it's not as intensive as it is supposed to be. So those are one of the issues that comes into play, and so it's still it's still a new trade, the publishing area in Africa compared to other continents.
Yeah. Okay, and now we're going to go back to the journalism thing again. When you decided to leave your job as a journalist, you're leaving a steady income, you're leaving creature comforts. What was the hardest part of that transition from being someone who is able to make a regular income to someone who is hoping that books sell in order to pay for your existence?
Well, after journalism, I went to work for one of the big four banks for about 4 years. And then that's when I left that particular job, to come and test, the market. So, you have to start somewhere, even though it's a very difficult market, in terms of selling books, especially African books in the South African market. So my motivation was that I needed to start somewhere just to see how it goes. And then, if I burn my fingers, then very well, at least I tried. So that's the motivation that I have. But, it is a very, very difficult market to be in. You will not become a multi-millionaire overnight, unfortunately,
So it's a passion project as much as it is a business.
Well, it's a business and then passion. It's a business because I need to put food on the table.
Yes, of course. Okay.
Because I have a wife, so of course, then it's a passion as well. So so you cannot divorce the one from the other. But I'm in love, with African literature. But I definitely need to put food on the table. Yeah.
All right. So when I first learned about Book Circle Capital, I immediately thought, okay, the Black African dream is being realized. There's brilliant progress in the streets in terms of, necessary vast exposure to our own literature. And this is something that we spoke about earlier, of course. But are people, particularly Black people, responding well to the offering? Are these books being bought by Black people?
Well, Black people do buy books, but given the dynamics in terms of the population dynamics in the country, it's not at a level where it's supposed to be. They are buying books, but unfortunately, it's still at a minute level. So, for instance, a bestseller in South Africa, I think it's about 5,000 books. Really.
Are you serious?
I think so. You can maybe double check with Tabi. So, if you sell 5,000 books, that's like, that's the bestseller, which is really ridiculous. In my opinion. Black people do buy books, but we need more Black people to buy books. So it's not at a level where I would say that we are crazily buying books. So one part of it could be the economics part of it, as I said before. Books are expensive because we pay a lot of tax. Some of the books are imported from abroad. I have to pay custom tax, and then also I need to pay VAT as well. And also the culture, it's also a cultural thing. We don't have a culture of, leisure reading, because sometimes in our communities, when you talk about books, people think that you're talking about academics, which is not necessarily the case. For instance, as you can see, there are some guys sitting over there, watching their kids play. but you don't even have one person, reading a book. So those are one of the dynamics that you need to consider compared to other cultures. I mean, other people go to parks and then they have a book in their hand, and then they'll be able to sit and have a picnic and then, go over a book. So we need to cultivate that particular culture.
Okay, we're going to take a short break because you have a customer in the building.
Have you ever thought about the power of social media? Social media has the power to make your business grow. Grow! Yeah. Why don't you let us manage your social media? Because our business is to see your business grow. Visit us at www.bstownmedia.co.za.
Okay, great. So we're back from that short break. Loyiso just sold a few books, which is amazing. I feel like I'm a good omen. All right. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the key milestones in your journey, or what have been some of the key milestones in your journey as a bookseller?
Well, it's to be able to come out of my comfort zone because, as I stated previously, I used to sell books on a part-time basis on markets. For me to be able to make that decision that I'll leave my full-time job, I had a lot of security in my full-time job. I was getting a salary almost every month. For the past year, I was not able to earn a salary. So whatever that I get in terms of profit here, I need to reinvest it into the business for the business to be able to, to prosper. So in terms of being able to take that particular step to say that this is it, I'm getting out of my comfort zone. And also in terms of the support that I also got from my family, from my wife, from my kids as well. I think that has been, the biggest milestone in terms of making this particular decision.
Okay, so in his book, A Time for New Dreams, Ben Okri gives children 10.5 suggestions on how they should pick books to read before they leave school. In one of his suggestions, he says, read for your own liberation and mental freedom. Do you have books that have allowed for your own personal mental freedom?
There are so many in the bookstore. But as I said, Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. That's a classical book. It's very much relevant. It was written in the 60s.
Your personal one?
My personal ones? Yeah. Definitely. As I said, that's Chinua Achebe.
Yeah.
You'll never get wrong, when it comes to him. But that particular book, Things Fall Apart. You can read it, 2,000 times and you'll never get tired of it. Because in terms of the messaging, in terms of the issues that are being raised there, in terms of the experiences, not only in South Africa, but in all African countries, it's so much relevant. Currently what is happening in Zimbabwe, if you were to read that particular book, you'll be able to see, what is, the message that is trying to convey. So definitely, that's the book that is outstanding to me. Of course, we have people like Zakes Mda, but personally, from my personal perspective, I love West African authors. They are the best, without undermining other authors, but West African authors, especially Nigerian authors, they are the best when it comes to the trade.
Why? Why do you think they're so good?
Well, I think their writing and also what they write about. Their writings are very much topical. And also in terms of the experiences, as I said, they speak, to our current experiences in Africa. But also remember that Nigeria is one of it's the most populous country in Africa. So I suppose maybe there are influences as well. There are Nigerians, all over the place. In virtually every country, even in Antarctica. So I guess maybe that influence also plays a part. But as I said, Chinua Achebe, all of his books, but in particular, Things Fall Apart, for me, that stands out.
Okay. So 2 questions about the future, and I'll ask it one at a time. What does the future of African literature look like for you?
Well, it depends, if we get the support, if there is a demand, to buy the books, then the future looks bright. But if the demand is very timid, it's very low, then, there's going to be a problem. I mean, compared to other literatures, I mean, everyone, even in the township, people know who John Grisham is. People love that. So I think that the more we sell and expose African literature as being one of the best as well as comparative literatures in the world, I think that there is a future. But as I said, I mean, it's a very tough market. If we ourselves don't buy, these particular books, then unfortunately, African literature will not grow, at a rate that we want it to be. But there is definitely a promising future ahead for this particular literature.
Okay. And the final question, I promise. The final question is what is the future of Book Circle Capital?
Well, I hope it will grow. I hope it will grow and become, one of the most competitive bookshops, not only in South Africa but also globally in the African continent. I mean, African continent as well as other, parts of the world. So that's basically my dream, But as I said, I'm still crawling. But hopefully, maybe in the next 5 years, we'll have much more centers around the country. But I know there is definitely interest in Cape Town as well as Durban. But it's also a matter of having, funding. That's one of the difficulties that we are experiencing in South Africa, especially small businesses, in terms of access to funding. So hopefully, maybe there's. I am talking, some funders, but as I said, it's a long-term, objective. But definitely. It's definitely here to stay, but it's not going to be easy going ahead. But hopefully in the next 5 years we'll have centers around the country and some other parts of the continent.
And that's it for this week. Keep up to date with what's in stock at Book Circle Capital by visiting its Instagram account at Book Circle Capital. Alternatively, you can visit the store and get a few really amazing titles. The store is located at 27 Boxes in Melville, Johannesburg. Right, to find out more about the Africans who drive various creative industries forward, make sure to follow Creative Ghettos on Instagram at Creative Ghettos. My name is Kwanele Kunene. Join me again next week Friday from 2 to 2:30 p.m. for another impactful show. Bye for now.
Harnessing the power of talk radio. Brandlive.co.za